Ja, okay, gut.
Den 90.
Ich druck's ja aus gleich, oder?
Ich brauche noch mittags.
Mittags, okay.
Das sind die Vorstellungssachen.
Genau.
Ich muss hier
Nee.
gestern hier in die Knolle gekommen sein.
Ja,
Kein Problem.
genau.
Hier.
Ich habe noch eine grundsätzliche Frage.
Band 1, ja? Eine komplette Überbautheorie der Schulverwaltung, Musik.
Ja, ja. Toll, dass du das erwähnst. Ja.
Das ist wunderbar zu reden. Und wir hatten irgendwie ein 55. Abiturtreffen jetzt. Und da habe ich das.
anfangen, Jens? So, good morning to everybody. It's my task and my pleasure to introduce Wolfgang Streeck, although I believe there's not much need to introduce him, because most of you will know at least his work. Wolfgang Streeck is Director Emeritus of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne, and one of the most important public intellectuals right now. In 2014, he published his book, Gekaufte Zeit, which became a bestseller in Germany and was immediately translated into many languages. For good reasons, because numerous readers within and outside the social sciences regarded and still regard this book as one of the most important and provocative Zeitdiagnosen published in the last 25 years. Buying Time, this was the English title, not only opened the debate about Europe and the future of the EU, but also about the future of capitalism in general, so that Streeck's arguments are and will be at the very center of political discourse. Despite, or maybe because of his retirement, which also took place in 2014, Streeck's productivity seems to increase year by year, so that it is even impossible to refer to all the important essays and books published since then. So just let me direct you to a collection of some of his essays published in 2016 with verso, How Will Capitalism End? Essays on a Failing System. And one more point, particularly addressed to all those who are not familiar with the field of the social sciences. Wolfgang Streeck, who got his academic education in Germany, was professor of sociology and industrial relations at the University of Wisconsin at Madison between 1988 and 1995, before he became director in Cologne. The denomination of this professorship might give you an idea about the very center of his research and the enormous territories he began to explore since then. Streeck not only shaped the famous debate on the varieties of capitalism and made enormously influential contributions to institutional thinking within sociology and the social sciences, he was and still is an expert on corporatism, on trade unions and union policy, on the politics of organized businesses, and even on vocational skills. The breadth of his empirical knowledge allowed him to write the book mentioned above, Gekaufte Zeit. And even if one doesn't like his arguments there, they are rather difficult to refute due to the enormous empirical background on which it is based. Wolfgang Streeck, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you. This is going to be a difficult exercise because when I finished this paper, I noticed that it was 35 pages long, and I really can't do this to you. So I have to remain seated here in order to be able to shuffle my notes around and switch between notes and manuscript. The exact title of the paper now is Driving Forces, History as Capitalist Development. It's a slightly different title, but that's really the program of the thing. History as development is the theme of the 19th century, and all the grand theories in the 19th century were about this modern society, where it had come from and where it was going. And the idea of directionality of change was fundamental to 19th century thinking, from Spencer to Durkheim, and of course including Karl Marx. Now, the idea here was sort of to define laws of motion that governed the course of history, either in a teleological way or at least in a sort of directional way. There was some sort of direction to history, and either that was, I mean, these theories were of sort of different complexity. Marxist theory was the most complex in my view, because he essentially had a sort of step-wise theory of global social change. There were different periods. These periods were sort of represented progress, but at the same time, the progress was sort of wrongly misorganized. For example, modernity was organized by capital as a process of capital accumulation. But these stages produced, at the same time as they advanced, produced their own dialectical negation. So capital accumulation produces the organized working class, as a result of which history moves to a higher stage. Now, this idea of a directionality of history was still present in the 1960s in modernization theories. Theories of modernization are basically very simplified extracts from the much richer 19th century thinking, then sort of dropped as a result of all sorts of things. In my view, the failure of the American model, that was in the 1970s when everybody gave up modernization theory. And whenever someone sort of wrote something that looked like philosophy of history, everybody reached for their guns. This is not. This was no longer allowed. So I would call this sort of a nihilistic view of history. Things change, they happen, but they could happen otherwise, and there's no movement in any direction. This, in my view, changed when we began to take stock of what I call the neoliberal revolution. There now, since the 1980s, we see sort of, or we have a strong sense of directionality. There's something like a historical trend. It happens not just in one country, it happens in a sort of parallel way in all these countries. And I think that was the point when people began to rediscover capitalism as a driven or driving historical process with leaders and laggards in different places, but they all sort of were moving in one direction. When this is, if this is true, then it sort of pays to take a look back at the most complex theory of historical change, namely Marxist theory. And this is what I do in this paper. The paper is essentially about working out an inherent problem of capitalism, which I call the subsistence economic temptation. This goes back to the chapters in the first volume on primitive accumulation, and I will use the primitive accumulation argument in order to try to construct an argument why this sort of resumption of directionality in the second half of the 20th century. My claim is that Marx is concerned with social integration as opposed to system integration ended relatively early as he was doing his theory. I think I will show you the point in Capital 1 where I think he stops thinking about this. This I call the routinization of violence. You will shortly see why. At that point, Marx's attention switches to the level of system integration. He had a problem that I would call the St. Paul problem. Who expected to? I know you know who I'm talking about. Who expected that during his lifetime he would see the end of the world? Marx expected that he would, during his lifetime, see the end of capitalism. Therefore, he didn't have to think much about the longer period. If you read sort of the St. Paul's letters to the various Christian communities, it's always like, tomorrow the world will be over, therefore don't marry, don't have children. Yeah, it's useless, absolutely senseless, because we will all, it will all end very soon. And of course that is a certain barrier to creative thinking, but or not. At any case, he sort of switched to the macro level, basically the falling, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I look at the. What I will do is I will look at the micro foundation of this post-Marxist period, where where social integration sort of continued in new ways, and where the subsistence economic temptation had to be fought with new methods. But I will spare you the historical details. So I move through Polanyi to the golden 30s after the Second World War. And I look at the 1960s, at the period, what I call the beginning breakdown of capitalist discipline. This was a time when, for example, Klaus Offe, who's with us today, wrote a dissertation on the end of the Leistungsprinzip, the principle of sort of reward by achievement. Yeah? That was a sort of widespread theme at the time, from André Gorz to Klaus Offe, whoever. And very soon this kind of completely turned around. We moved into a meritocratic, a newly meritocratic sort of society. And I will look at this resumption, this process in some more detail, and I will use finally the notion of money, the idea of money and the monetization of social relations, looking in particular at the expansion of female paid employment as an important turning point in this sort of rejuvenation, restoration of capitalist vigor. I begin with what I call the routinization of violence. To explore the potential contribution of the Marxian tradition, enriched with a sociological theory of money, the contribution to a postmodern theory of history, one could say, we may go back to how Marx describes the rise of capitalism out of late medieval society. Not surprisingly, when history is conceived as a history of class struggles, the designated vehicle moving society from feudalism to capitalism, or as Marx puts it, the midwife of capitalist development, is violence. In two respects. First, violence was needed to centralize society's means of production by expropriating their pre-modern owner-users, as in the enclosure movement, the clearing of the estates and the like. Expropriation was accomplished with feudal means of violence, from brute force to the legal system controlled by the feudal elites about to become capitalist. One of the first things Marx wrote was his report on the Landtag in the Rhineland, debating this issue of wood theft after the redefinition of communal property into private property. Not only did this put the land to more profitable uses, increasing, in the language of modern economics, its productivity, it also, in today's labor market policy and human resource management speak, it set free labor from the rural subsistence economy by expelling the peasantry from the countryside, thereby depriving them of their traditional livelihood and making them available for transformation into modern wage workers. And I will say something on this in a little more elaborate way. As an aside, money was important already there. The reason, according to Marx, why a new generation of the feudal aristocracy drove the rural population out of its accustomed way of life was a growing demand for high-quality wool from the tapestry manufacturers in Flanders, which made it tempting to replace the English peasantry with sheep. Rather than having to content themselves with 1/10 or two of a village's natural produce, or with the services peasants had to furnish during a fixed share of their time, they, the feudal nobility, were now paid in money by the Flanders customers. Money which they could spend on whatever they desired, unless they chose to invest it to make it produce even more money. And here's sort of a crucial quote from Capital Volume 1. The rapid rise of the Flemish wool manufacture, and I must say this is a footnote, he doesn't elaborate much on this, but it's one of those sparkling ideas that he sort of injects into his writing. The rapid rise of the Flemish wool manufacturers and the corresponding rise in the price of wool in England gave the direct impulse to these evictions. The old nobility had been devoured by the great feudal wars. In parentheses, this is exactly the Spencerian explanation why society moves from military to industrial society, or from status to contract. Yeah? The old nobility had been devoured by the great feudal wars. Now comes the new nobility, was the child of its time, and now italics mine, but you can't see them, but they are here, for which money was the power of all powers. Yeah? And that's absolutely exciting to see this, this is just mentioned as an aside remark. From the perspective of feudal England, the continental money economy may be seen as an exogenous force that upset its established equilibrium by creating a structural opportunity for traditional greed to change into modern greed. Looking at capitalism as an emerging global system, of course, the increased European money supply that upended European feudalism, beginning in England, dates back in large part to another process of primitive accumulation, in which the Spaniards in particular appropriated with fire and sword the gold and silver of the indigenous civilizations of the Americas. Returning to England, violence performed yet another equally indispensable task. By itself, the labor shakeout in the rural economy was not enough for capitalism to take off. An enduring system, systemic problem in capitalism, as will be seen very much until today, is a fundamental conflict between two different economic rationalities, or with Weber, Wirtschaftsethiken. One traditionalist, the other modern. Traditionalist economic rationality minimizes the input used to produce a fixed output. It is a rationality of a subsistence economy, where one works as long and only as long as one needs to secure a customarily defined level of consumption. Modern economic rationality, by comparison, uses to the fullest extent any available potentially productive resources so as to maximize what they produce. It is the rationality required for a growth economy where production depends on productive capacities, not consumptive needs. Input minimization and output maximization are both rational in that each of them requires efficiency calculations, although in one case aimed at minimizing time for work and in another at maximizing the result of work. Transiting from feudalism to capitalism or from pre-modern to modern society requires a change in economic orientation from subsistence-oriented input minimization to growth-oriented output maximization, a transition that is far from natural, as it involves not a potentially gradual progress from irrationality to rationality, as believed by standard economics, see North and Thomas as a sort of evolutionary theory of increasing rationality, but it involves a change from one social use of rationality to another, a deep behavioral or cultural reorientation connected to a new worldview and way of life. Capitalist modernity must dislodge pre-capitalist traditionalism for capital accumulation to work. In Weber, Protestantism, which decoupled work effort from consumption and ensured that it was continued and intensified regardless of what may have previously been considered or socially defined as a satisfactory level of subsistence, both among workers and of capitalists. It was by transforming Erwerbsarbeit from a means to an end into an end in itself that Protestantism enabled the transformation of medieval feudalism into modern capitalism. In several places in Capital, Marx notes the contribution of Protestantism to the great transformation of feudal into capitalist society. More important, however, were for him the various forms of coercion applied in the modernist re-education of the medieval peasantry, in what Marx called the formation of the modern working class. Here, the chapter on the working day is pertinent, where Marx describes at length the struggle of early employers of labor, of wage labor, and of still feudal governments in the late medieval period against the subsistence mentality of the workers of the time, which came to the fore whenever wages increased as a result of labor shortage. Typically, once a worker had earned what he traditionally required to cover his customary needs, he would disappear a day or two before Sunday. Die waren wirklich blau, also nicht? Die waren, if surplus value is defined as the difference between the product of labor power and the costs of its reproduction, extracting it from the labor process to make fixed capital investment profitable was impossible, where workers stopped working once they had covered the costs of their reproduction. Thus, government was called in to set under threat of punishment, this is what Marx describes at length in this chapter, under threat of punishment, legal minimum working hours and maximum wages. The exact opposite of what workers were fighting for and finally gained once the transition to capitalism had been made. Moreover, to instill in workers the work ethic needed for capitalism, the medieval poor laws on which the dislocated former peasantry relied for support had to be revised or revoked. The unemployed had to be placed in workhouses where they were brutally taught the ethical value of hard work. And corporal punishment, including all sorts of torture and indeed the death penalty, had to be legislated to fight vagabondage and idleness among the former peasants that had been driven from the land. So Hartz IV is nothing in comparison, although it serves roughly the same function. The introduction of capitalist property relations, the use of violence to turn medieval subsistence farmers into modern wage workers receded once capitalism had become firmly established. In one of the most remarkable sections of Capital, Marx describes a process to which I refer here as routinization, parallel to Weber's routinization of charisma. So I quote, "The advance of capitalist production," Marx writes, "develops a working class, which by education, tradition, habit, looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The dull compulsion of economic relations completes the subjection of the laborer to the capitalist. Dull compulsion, direct force outside economic conditions is only exceptionally. In the ordinary run of things, the laborer can be left to the natural laws of production," he writes in quotation marks, "that is, to his dependence on capital, a dependence springing from and guaranteed in perpetuity by the conditions of production themselves." So, fully developed, so I continue and say, fully developed capitalism, that is to say, emancipates itself from the forces it had needed to come into being, cuts itself loose from its past, with no need even to remember it, and grounds it in hard structural constraints that maintain the new order by making it an objective reality to which there appears to be no alternative. It is difficult not to be reminded here of Weber's metaphoric description of mature capitalism as an iron cage holding its inmates to the economic ethic of Protestantism, although they may never have even heard of it, without having to be only remotely aware of the charisma that in the reified form of an established Alltag, that's Weber's core concept here, an established everyday life, controls the way they live. In fact, one wonders whether Weber, as he was writing the final chapter of the Protestant Ethic, where the iron cage appears, whether Weber must not have been looking at Marx's paragraph on the formation of the modern working class, adopting the figure of thought he found there, while separating it from its materialistic frame to make it fit his own normative idealistic. I know Weber never quotes Marx, but you find entire chapters where you know that he had the capital right here. I will now sort of jump over several steps in the argument, where I sort of try to solve St. Paul's problem and move from economic need as the new sort of routinized violence to rising consumption norms. The two world wars are very important in instilling and organizing factory discipline, not just incidentally in the West, but also in the Soviet Union. Trotsky, the militarization of work, where he faced the Russian peasants who just couldn't understand why they should show up 9 o'clock sharp and begin to work. Like us here, we also have to show up 9 o'clock, and we do it, whereas the Russian peasants didn't do it. And then I go on to the 30 years after the Second World War of the post-war settlement. Excuse me. And this section of the paper is titled "Temptation Defeated." As time passed, a dialectical downside of a pacified, democratic, class-compromised, and at least domestically non-violent, domestically meaning in the countries of the core, of the capitalist core, non-violent capitalism made itself felt. A temptation to return to a traditionalist subsistence mentality, now that all economic needs were taken care of, a relapse into traditionalism that would in effect undermine the willingness of workers to work their full potential, accumulation to continue. And it's important in the sociological, in this theory of social integration that I'm trying to develop here, that one needs to see the history of capitalism post-Marx as a sort of ever new invention of ways of keeping people continuing to work the way they are supposed to work under capitalism. So if you study human resource management, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Indeed, in the 1970s at the latest, concerns were mounting that the 3 exceptional decades after the Second World War might have given rise to a creeping cultural revolution that might fatally undermine capitalism. Daniel Bell. All of a sudden, the system of wage labor, as it had developed in the Fordist era, had come under attack. Alienation became a key concept in public discourse, not just among a few crazy sociologists, to be overcome by industrial democracy, ending unilateral managerial rule. Liberation in work was to be accompanied by liberation from work in the form of shorter working hours, made possible by rising productivity due to mechanization and automation. That was a core theme at the time. Those of you who haven't been around, you can do some research on it. The idea was to use the increased productivity to free people from work, not to pile up more and more products for consumption. The implied idea was that basic needs had been taken care of during the golden era. So Keynes's dream of a world in which work had to be rationed because otherwise, if everybody worked like hell, they would produce totally useless stuff. In his chapter on the economic prospects of our grandchildren, Keynes' dream was approaching reality. In a new subsistence economy, human activity was increasingly to take place outside of the labor market and free from capitalist wage slavery. Behind the manifold work and life reform projects of the period was an unprecedented increase in the power of workers at the workplace and in society. Labor markets were swept empty. Unemployment was at an all-time low. In Germany, we had an unemployment crisis in 1967 when we had 0.2% unemployment. Yeah, 0.2% unemployment. Wages had been rising year by year, all of which made workers more insistent and increasingly audacious in demanding further progress. Strikes were frequent. Wage settlements tended to exceed productivity gains, and employers began to offer work redesign and worker participation in exchange for wage moderation. Even so, labor market conditions increasingly became a bottleneck for economic growth, also because the high wages necessitated by a tight labor market caused profits to decline. Was this the end of capitalist history? The evolutionary dynamics of capitalism defeated and the direction of historical development diverted by the lure of a renewed subsistence economy. Only a few years later, the neoliberal revolution had set in, subjecting capitalist economies once again to the driving force of capitalism. Of this was a secular rehabilitation of wage labor, and not just for the happy few who were invited after 1968 to join the new allegedly creative service industries like Boltanski and Capello. Participation in paid labor increased across the board at the lower and the upper end of the market, and the largest part of the increase was accounted for by women, who until shortly ago enjoyed as a privilege that they were excused from selling their labor power as long as their husbands were able to earn what was then called a family wage. Money, I suggest, played a central part in the restoration of capitalist progress, and not just in an economic but also in a social sense. As a medium not only of capitalist exchange but also of capitalist expansion. Now I come to the core of this proposal that I want to make. Obviously, money measures the size and growth of a modern economy by making it possible to quantify the value of economic transactions and aggregate them into a total value for an economy as a whole. Economic growth, then, is the increase of that total over a given period of time. Note that only monetized transactions can be included. Where there is no payment or no payment is reported, there is for statistical but also for taxation and surplus extracting purposes no economy. Only monetization of exchange allows for gains and losses to be minutely enough calculated and compared intersubjectively and across spheres of economic activity for profit to be determined and surplus value to be extracted, which can then become capital, producing even more capital, which is the idea of capitalism. While there can be and have been money economies without capitalism, there cannot be capitalism without a money economy. Moreover, because of certain properties of money as an institution, it tends to promote replacement of non-monetized voluntary with monetized commercial exchange, making monetization into something like a self-driven, self-reinforcing evolutionary tendency. That's what I want to claim. I will discuss these properties, taking as an example the increase in female labor market participation in and after the 1970s, a development that contributed in a major way to the defeat of the subsistence economic temptations at the time and the subsequent revival of the capitalist evolutionary dynamic. I will now sort of elaborate this a little bit, and I will prepare you for the fact that I end at this point. It is, however, necessary, if one wants to do justice to the entire argument, to then go on to what I call the quantitative easing aspect of this. The most important thing about money is works and social integration on the ground, and at the same time it is sort of a very sophisticated, centralized, nationalized institution that can be used from above to below and goes from below to above, and the interplay between the flushing of societies with money in the period, especially after the 1990s, and let's say the vertical element of the money process, and simultaneously the penetration of money, the replacement of traditional exchange relations with monetized relations, they come together, because what I'm now talking about is conditional upon the ample provision of freely created money for sort of flushing everything and making sure that monetization can actually happen, mostly through debt. But Aaron Zah, I don't know whether he's here. He's the ultimate expert on this. So capitalist progress restored, and I will limit myself to this slightly provocative part of my argument. And then I stick to my time limitation that I negotiated with them. Supply shortages in the labor market became the overriding concern of employers in the 1970s. After the wave of unofficial strikes in 1968 and 1969. Internationalization of production chains, at the time getting underway, transferred a growing share of the value added to countries with the national had since the early 60s been used to alleviate labor shortages in the industrial centers. Soon, however, this was complemented by a broad attempt to mobilize the reserves of labor power held in the traditional family. In addition to wage relations spreading out horizontally to the periphery, this involved vertical digging into the fabric of social life at the center, unearthing, as it were, the hidden treasures of a society that still used a significant share of its labor power for unpaid activities embedded in primary non-market social relations. Mobilizing female labor power for the market proved spectacularly successful and was instrumental in rehabilitating the institution of wage labor. The process that then went underway may be described as capitalist land grabbing in the sense of Rosa Luxemburg's theory of imperialism and colonialism, except that now colonization was internal rather than external, intruding into the still extensive pre-modern, pre-capitalist life world, surviving in the nooks and crannies of advanced capitalist societies. Labor market participation of women increased steeply as two-people households released a growing share of their combined weekly lifetime into the labor market, there to be transformed into wage labor, providing capital with workers that were very much like immigrants, happy to be admitted, willing to work for less in order to get in, resistant to unionization, and ideally suited socially for the growing labor-intensive service sector, underpaid also, as manufacturing was moving on to less demanding political economic environments. The movement of female labor out of the household into the market began in the 1970s, into what was then commonly referred to as wage dependency and more often than not as wage slavery. Trying to account for its dynamism, one cannot be satisfied with economistic explanations pointing to lower growth and the breaking of trade unions forcing families to defend their living standards, or better, their established post-war expectation of steadily rising living standards by sending what used to be housewives to work becoming completely identified with work for money. While all of this is true, there's a second story here, one of liberalization as liberation, of marketization meaning not just expulsion from earlier ways of life, but also emancipation from them, of household and family as village and the labor market as town, of wage slavery harboring a promise of freedom. Primitive accumulation, by way of driving individuals out of pre-modern societies, need not only rely on sticks, but can also offer carrots. While in Capital, Marx largely neglects this, he was well aware of it. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, again my italics, patriarchal idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man, and in the present context woman, to his natural superiors. Thereby, he continues, rescuing a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Yeah? Exactly what kind of freedom is it that comes with wage slavery replacing unpaid domesticity? As labor is marketized, exchange relations are monetized. Labor is marketized, exchange relations are monetized. Performance is rewarded by money rather than by personal approval, respect, or love. Expansion of the range of impersonal, monetized transactions in a society is the very essence of capitalist development, involving either adding new monetized transactions to old non-monetized ones, or converting non-monetized into monetized new transactions. In Polanyi, that development is stylized as a horizontal diffusion of self-regulating markets into society, especially as an encroachment of the market form of exchange for goods on the three fictitious commodities, land, labor, and money. I suggest, however, that the process of marketization is better understood if it is conceived as one of monetization of social relations, governed by specific social properties of money as seminally spelled out by Georg Simmel. Working for money makes individuals independent from particular other individuals or collectivities. In fact, monetized rewards from different sources can both be compared under an exact objective metric and added and saved. Moreover, in a monetized environment, work can be performed in accordance with incentives offered rather than in fulfillment of moral obligations, and transactions, instead of being governed by collective norms, can be individually rational. Not least, if work is paid in impersonal money instead of personal social approval, payment can be used to acquire goods far beyond what can be furnished by and within any given personalized community. Actually, the indeterminacy of money with respect to its potential uses enables owners of money to indulge in fictional expectations, Jens Beckert, of the most exotic future satisfactions. You can simply think about anything that you want to do with your money. Rural villages where work is obligatory, payment is personal, and choice is constrained by local tradition, whereas markets are like cities, where money enables individuals to distance themselves from primary social relations and the obligations that come with them, to pursue whatever their particular interests and desires may be. This is not to say that there are no downsides to the marketization of human labor for women. In the social world of the 1970s, however, they must have seemed negligible in the light of an apparently deepening discontent with the sexual division of labor in the subsistence economy of the family. With time, the discontents of the capitalist labor process, managerial pressure, steady intensification of work, uncertainty of future employment, etc., undoubtedly made themselves felt. But by then, the capitalist iron cage seems to have been safely in place, and women had been socialized into capitalist lifeways almost like men had before. Moreover, worker dependence on capital has many facets. As workers become fully integrated in paid employment, their life begins to organize itself around it. From a certain point on, being out of paid work ceases to mean having free time for oneself. Instead, it means being excluded from contacts central to one's social identity and social life. For example, increasingly it is only around workplaces that people meet sexual partners and potential spouses. One consequence is growing homogamy within occupational status groups. Culturally, working for money becomes a matter of honor, as it indicates command of sought-after capacities. It also indicates self-sufficiency, being able to do without material support from others, and owing no expressions of gratitude to particular individuals. It's all paid. Not being employed thus becomes a reason to be ashamed, in particular among women, where being a housewife has become has become contemptible, not just regrettable. Apparently, in very short time, the marketization of female labor became self-reinforcing through the deep changes it caused in family life. Easier access of women to money coincided with the steep rise in divorce rates in all Western countries. Typically, divorce was sought not by men but by women, who now had the material means to, quote, live their own life. Economic independence, achieved through wage dependence, supported more individualistic lifestyles in yet other respects. Beginning in the 1970s, a growing share of the children born in rich capitalist countries were born to unmarried mothers. It's declined, but the share of unmarried children from unmarried couples increased in that declining total, due to less stable partnerships and more time needed, and in any time used for work, a concept that now became finally synonymous with paid work. Housewives don't work, even if they raise 5 children. In turn, as marital partnerships became less reliable, not to mention less available, single motherhood became a realistic prospect, if not an option, for a growing number of women. First, most important source of poverty, at least in this country. Meanwhile, family law was evolving to cut alimony entitlements after divorce on the assumption that divorced women should work, regardless of number and age of their children. And you see the whole toolkit for the normalization of a modern workforce, as Marx sort of in this wonderful paragraph. Similarly, social welfare legislation changed across countries to make single mothers take up employment, to increase women's labor market participation, working for money, building up the career, thus became imperative for women, if only as a precaution against unpredictable markets and unreliable partnerships. There was never an idea of sort of dividing work for money equally between men and women. Everybody works 25 hours. Right? That was a sort of the French idea of the 35 hours week was, in my view, the only case where this was tried, and it broke apart. Higher female labor market participation helped capitalism recover from its post-war crisis, not just by raising the labor supply and thereby moderating wage pressure. It also reinvigorated demands for products and services and generally accelerated the transition to consumer capitalism after the threat of market saturation in the 1960s. Women now spending their own money without having to ask their husbands for permission, as Selitzer still describes it for the United States, became the most important source of growth in old and new markets for consumer goods, services, and entertainment. Fashion and design cycles were shortened, speeding up innovation and product turnover. With time, feminization of consumption extended to men as well, who are today spending more than ever on dress, hairdressing, cosmetics. Not me, but quite a few others. The turning point in Germany was when, in the 1970s, shops began to offer multicolored underwear for men. attacked in vain by activists of the social democratic left as an example of capitalist waste. Yeah, I think we're coming to close here. One more paragraph, and then we are done. Increased participation of women in the labor market also changed the structure and functioning of families. Commercialization of female labor spilled over into activities such as cooking, cleaning, and childcare, contracted out by families to free up time for paid work. Ari Hochschild and others have described this in detail. What is done through unpaid labor in the family and what is bought for money from outside providers, make or buy, came to be a matter of comparing costs and returns. What used to be household chores is taken over by firms, small and large, monetizing previously non-monetized activities, thereby making them available for taxation and inclusion in economic growth statistics. This applies in particular to care work, which, with rising female employment outside the home, is taken over by private or public providers, often by a combination of the two. Monetization of care is typically accompanied by public policies, helping families informally to complement the care work they pay for, as in most cases, especially middle-class families, only part of this can be contracted out because of its costs. For example, in many countries, expensive efforts are made by governments to re-educate fathers to share equally in the raising of children so that women can devote themselves rather than staying home or working only part-time, and so on and so on. So one more remark on the economics of this. It is interesting that there's not a single country that I know of where people would argue that since people are now getting older anyway, during the time of childbearing or child raising, at least as long as the children are small, both parents should take time off and then later work more. Yeah. That is not that. Now we have this situation where in your between your age 25 and age 35, a family sort of is fighting every day to be able to fulfill the schedule of 2 full jobs and taking care of 2 children. They have to go to school and to crash and whatever. An enormous intensification of life, an enormously rigid, self-imposed discipline on everyday life. Yeah? Which is absolutely astonishing because it occurs at a time when people are much richer than they ever were before. Yeah, but they need that SUV, and they have to work. They're all indebted up to their ears anyway. These American families, the entire debt of an American hardworking family, if you add it across the United States, it is higher than the entire debt of the Chinese economy. Mechanism of imposing work discipline on you. So I conclude with a memory of an interview I did 20 years ago, or even more, in the United States with a manager at Ford, who were setting up a new plant in Wisconsin, and I was interested in how they select their workforce. So I went to see the guy, and I asked him how many applications. 100,000 people had applied for the 2,000 jobs he had. And I said, well, how in the world do you compile a short list on this? And he said, well, there's three categories. One, they can't be in a trade union. I said, I understand that, yeah. Second, they have to be married. I said, yeah, okay. And third, they have to have a mortgage. Because, and I asked him naively, why a mortgage? And he said, a worker with a mortgage never goes on strike. Okay, I conclude here.
Well, thank you very much, Wolfgang Streeck. I think we should give us 20 minutes for discussion. And since we only have 20 minutes, please ask very short but brilliant questions. Axel Paul.
Thank you very much for the Thank you very much for the provocative and also entertaining talk, although the topic is very serious. I have one remark and one question. The remark is, aren't you overemphasizing the argument of violence or coercion in, one, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and second, the reinvigorization of capitalism in the 1970s? You underlined already that the liberalization of the women was felt as a liberation, and I would emphasize exactly that argument. That's my remark. The question is, how does the unemployment of the 70s fit into your story? And I'm wondering whether it could be reintroduced if you consider financialization, which did not show up in your talk. Thanks.
Maybe we should already collect, because there are around 8 people on the list.
Yeah, but look, these are good questions, and maybe you,
yeah,
maybe
it was
you
brilliant, but not too short.
Maybe you take a second question, and then I answer 2 questions in
okay.
one.
Frau Müller. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm.
No? Yeah.
Okay. I'm not short. Sorry, because I also want to explain a little bit my question and bring in some context. Your analysis, your beautiful analysis, sounds to many extent like what we hear as from the very conservative side. So the claiming that feminism and the bringing women into work has all these causes is now in the heart of the new conservative criticism of postmodernity, status of housewives, etc. So, let's think about Nancy Fraser talking about the marriage between neoliberalism and feminism. So there is a talk going on which precisely identifies the role of female work for this neoliberal capitalism. So I'm not against this, but this goes a little bit to question, because we are not in AfD discussion here, the turning point. So I'll be back to the questions of how to more fairly, in a better way, organize working time over a time span. So do we need a new movement for better organization of working time or basic income or something? Is this your answers to your analysis? So I do not assume that you want this housewife status back.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. If you want to do good social science, you cannot avoid being risque at some point. Yeah, I don't want to be I don't want to be constrained by what some people say, whether they are right or wrong. If I think something is the way it is, I put it that way. Yeah. And I also think that sociology is not obliged to deliver a problem solution together with the analysis of the problem. Let's sort of simply agree on the fact. As far as that is concerned, yeah, Nancy Fraser does good work on this problem. I think, but as far as the sort of what you call the conservative, yeah, I'm conservative in the sense that I think there should be a space in human life that is not marketized. That's conservative. And in that sense, I'm completely conservative. Yeah. Then of course, no. It could be organized in all sorts of ways. Modern life must be organized. So for example, you could have cooperatives. You could have all sorts of communal. But the analysis I'm doing here shows that once you have this sort of the universal penetration of money into social relations, makes it very hard to organize these alternative ways of a return to a communal way of life out of an individualized, monetized way of life is extremely difficult to organize. because there is a current temptation to solve problems by borrowing something and then spending the money on it. Yeah? And we know this from our everyday life. Shouldn't we say that? So that's one. No, financialization, I have an entire chapter on this, because my argument is that this sort of the flushing of social relations with money is possible only together with a monetary policy that provides money in abundant supply. Yeah, you have to be able to borrow in order to do this. And since the 1990s, people were sort of enabled to borrow almost limitlessly. And as far as violence is concerned, no, in fact, I think, first of all, I suggest these two chapters, chapter 24 on primitive accumulation in the German edition, and this chapter 8 or so on the working day. And you'll see he's not scarce on empirical detail as to how in the English economy how workers were violently transformed into. And then, of course, you have to add to this, which Marx sort of only mentions in footnotes. You have to add to this the enormous orgy of violence on the periphery of the capitalist world system, beginning to organize itself in the Americas, in Asia, everywhere else. Slavery is sort of absolutely central to the growth of capitalism, because you had to take these African peasants who were not used to this kind of work discipline and force them to work so that capital could be increased. And that you did with a whip, because they just didn't understand this thing. And now, if you go to the margins of the capitalist system and you look at what is now called development policy or development aid, you see this complete misunderstanding that people think there are little Germans or little Americans sitting and only waiting to be given some cash, and then they set up a business, and in 3 years they are rich.
Okay, Klaus, often the lady behind.
I found this very helpful, the distinction between two kinds of economic rationality, the traditional one with input minimization, and the modern one with output maximization. That is really helpful. And it reminded me of a dilemma in industrial relations. Do you want to fight for higher wages, or do you want to fight for free time?
Yeah.
And this conflict between time and money is basic to your analysis, yeah, and for many things. And the argument I would like to provoke you is that the struggle between time as a medium of reward and money is lost for time and won for money. Because time, under modern conditions, is worthless unless it cannot be combined with money. You need money in order to have an enjoyable free time. And the most important thing is, in the nature of time, you cannot save time. 20 minutes today, 20 minutes tomorrow do not make a longer, yep, weekend. Whereas with money you can accumulate, yeah. And that is a difference, and that explains why the devaluation of free time and the self-propelling logic of female labor market participation. It is much more valuable to earn money rather than to have free time. Free time often is equal to boredom, and self-propelling the process is because, if you wish, office law number 13, the more women work, the more women work, through a substitution effect.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And so.
I can directly connect to that, Claudia Wiesner, University of Hamburg. I have a remark and a question. The remark, obviously, is a critical one, because when you told that very nice story of equal female labor market participation, I was wondering where the statistics come in, which tell us that in the Federal Republic of Germany, but also in other countries, women do work part-time when they have small children, whereas the men work 100 or 120%. We know that women do most of the reproductive work in the household. Still, men don't. We know that women who have small children work very often not at all. We know all this about Ehegattensplitting and so on, and we know who does all the reproductive work. So I had the impression that in your picture, so I was sort of quite fascinated, saying, gosh, this is a world I would like to live in. Unfortunately, I don't live in that world, because the reality is not really like you depict it. And it follows from it that it's not so easy to be at the free disposal of the labor market. And I'm not talking about wage differences, etc. So I buy part of this picture, and I especially like this marketization as a kind of liberation of women part. And I think it's true to a certain extent, but I think you forgot about what is called geschlechtsspezifische Arbeitsteilung in German, and all those power differences between women and men, which we see, which are there. So where do they come in your picture?
Short answer.
This is difficult, but yeah, no, I could subscribe to most of what you've been saying. But if you look at, for example, public policy or all the institutional pointers, like what should you do, it's always like we have to increase the participation of women. We have to sort of invent all sorts of inducements to do this. And then, of course, they fight against some sort of what they perceive traditionalism. I want to also see in that tradition, not just Susan Watkins of the New Left Review in the last issue published a wonderful, longish article on the women's movement since the 1990s to today. It's extremely impressive. What you see there is that she makes the point that I'm making in a much better way, much more clearly, namely that these traditions are both oppressive and at the same time might be the only way, if you sort of revive them in an egalitarian way, to extract human labor from the big beast, which is called the capitalist accumulation process. Yeah, but Adorno, whoever, they all knew this, sort of that tradition has this double face. Yeah, and time and money, Klaus. Yeah, this is really true, and I add something to it. The more monetized a society is and the more individualized the way of life, the fewer are the moments in which you can gratification outside of a money nexus. You always have to pay for everything. Yeah? And because the society has also sort of downgraded in terms of values everything that doesn't cost much. And so for example, my funniest example is the sex toys industry. Yeah? Today, sex toys are completely sort of tabooized and tabooized, and you see them, you can buy them everywhere. But this is sort of the sort of sexual gratification that comes without personal contact. But you pay for it. Yeah? And if you look at it from this perspective, you see many examples of this. The replacement of sort of, you could say, cooperative volunteers with technology.
Okay. Thomas Piketty and Ansage.
Yeah, so this is very interesting, but I think you neglect political forces, you know, in the sense that the way you stress how powerful capitalist forces are to push for monetization And you know, it's very interesting, but I think this makes you maybe a bit too fatalistic and to neglect you know, differences in country trajectories, which are very important. So when you talk about the increased monetization and increased intensification of labor, well, you have huge differences. You know, market labor time today in Germany or France is a lot smaller than what it was in the 60s, whereas in the US, maybe your mortgage workers is in a different situation. So you have these huge differences, and in your general analysis of capitalism, you know, I don't see this, and I think this is problematic, because if we want to understand the future and the alternative, you have to be less fatalistic. Other example, you know, increasing female participation was not the same in every country, and in fact, the countries where it increased more, for instance, you know, if we go in Europe, you know, it increased more in France than in Germany, or in Britain, or in the US than in Germany or Japan, for instance, where in fact the countries where it increased less, typically Germany and Japan, are also the countries where fertility declines the most, which suggests, you know, that here you have a conflict between a norm, a patriarchal norm, which is still stronger in Germany, and which at some point I could sort of guess by listening to you. I must say, you know, you seem to have an attachment to you know, maybe not to housewife, but at least to this traditional model, which is stronger than what I hear in other countries. But the reaction of women in many cases is just not to have children at all. So in the end, you know, all these differences across countries, and you know, the potentially reactionary dimension of the you know, housewife discourse, you know, was sort of absent in your presentation.
Okay, sorry. Unfortunately, we have then to close because we are running out of time.
Thank you. Yes, Wolfgang. We want our workers to have a wife and a mortgage. I heard that from products in Washington, County Durham, not D.C., in 1978, and they were still allowed to be in unions. But anyway, I think you're touching on two interrelated long-run logics of development. One is capitalist development, and the other one, I think you touched it more frequently by mentioning the iron cage of bondage, is, I think, in my perception of it, more related to bureaucratic organization. And that has a somewhat independent logic of development rooted in the formation of the what Weber called the Anstaltsförmiger Staat, which is not purely idealistic. You know, it's a sort of Occidental state formation with a particular societal logic. Capitalist theme, but also somewhat independent. There's also a theme of, let's say, rising educational formative aspirations. My master's students, when they finished their thesis, and I was marking it, they took a pleasure trip to Costa Rica or India. One of them killed himself riding around India in a motorcycle. In our days, you know, well, this has capitalist logic, but it's not only sort of you know, striving for gainful advance. No, it's also education, formation of the self, and so on.
Okay. Short and brilliant answer.
Short and brilliant. The title of the paper, what was it? Leute, you get, the new one.
Driving forces, social development.
Driving forces. Thomas, I'm interested here in reconstructing sort of a logic of development that can be contested. It's a logic of development. It's there. It's going on. And then in my Polanyian worldview, there is always a possibility, as you rightly say, to try to find ways of domesticating the animal, so to speak. But one needs to know what kind of animal we're contesting with, and that animal is a powerful one. And I want to make sure that people understand that it's still alive, and that it has a sort of tendency to move in a direction. It wants to get there. And if we want to do something about it, we have to face it the way it is. That's what I'm doing here. Yeah? It's not fatalistic. It's simply, I'm a sort of spy who reports on the army of the enemy. Yeah? I'm the sort of the observer of the enemy.
I want you to come with a plan.
Yeah, but I'm not the, you're the general staff. I'm the intelligence service.
Okay. Okay, I think that was a great remark. Thank you very much, Wolfgang Streeck, for the debate, and thank you very much for the discussion. So in the hallways there are coffee stations, and be back here in this room, please, at 11:45.